Okay, so again, I'm going to share my slideshow, and if we need to back out of that to let more people in, we'll do that. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen with you all, and we will get going. We hope. Okay, give me just 1 minute. There we go. Okay. Hello there. If you are just joining us, we're just now getting started. Again, today's session will be based on the Montessori prepared environment and how to set up and show Montessori materials. The prepared environment, a core principle of the Montessori philosophy. I've included here a quote from Maria Montessori's text, The Advanced Montessori Method, that says, "The school should become a place where the child may live in freedom. The entire organism of the child ought to find school the best conditions for his development." Now, while that quote is necessarily applicable to schools, I feel it can be applied to the home environment as well. Let's talk about some of the characteristics of a Montessori prepared environment. Again, whether that be in a school setting or in a home type of setting. So first and foremost, when we're looking at a Montessori setting, we are looking at the characteristics of that environment. And the first thing we're looking at is the physical health that can be seen in that environment. So we are looking very closely at fresh air and natural light. We want to make sure that the children have an access to a bathroom and a water source. A lot of the activities and lessons we present in a Montessori prepared environment do need access to water. So making sure that the children have a bathroom and a water source readily available. Children in a Montessori prepared environment need space. They need room to move around freely. That can include indoor space and outdoor space. In a Montessori prepared environment, the children will fluctuate from an indoor space to an outdoor space at will. And the children can work in both of those areas equally. It's important to keep in mind that in a prepared environment, we need to maintain a proper temperature for health and safety, and encouraging children to be focused and concentrated on their materials. Also, when looking at health and safety, we want to make sure that our space is clean and well prepared and aesthetically pleasing to the eye. And the same in that outdoor space. We want to make sure that it's prepared in advance, even though it's an outdoor space. We want to make sure that we're offering motives for activity. Basically, we want to offer learning materials. We want to make sure that there are experiences for children to participate in, whether they be indoors or outdoors. And of course, we want to make sure that our spaces are beautiful. We're also looking at some psychic health of children in the Montessori prepared environment. Again, I mentioned beauty. In a Montessori prepared environment, we encourage our children to direct their own learning, the same that you would be doing at home. We ask each of our children to make choices about what they might want to work on or what they'd like to learn more about, or choose materials based on their interests. So what we want to make sure we're doing in a Montessori prepared environment is making materials that draw the child's eye. A child is more likely to make a selection independently if the material that they're choosing from is beautiful and aesthetically pleasing. So that's just something to keep in mind. And we'll go into more detail about that here in a few minutes when we talk about how to set up and share Montessori materials. Keeping in mind some characteristics of that Montessori prepared environment, you want to make sure that the furnishings you have included in this environment are child-sized tables, child-sized chairs, access to the water source. If you don't have, of course, a child-sized sink, using some sort of climbing tower or ability for them to reach the water source independently would be valuable. Something to keep in mind, especially in moving into this next section of order, is we want to keep in mind that everything in a Montessori prepared environment should be found at the child's eye level. So sometimes when we're preparing these environments, we have to kind of get down and get low and get on the child's level to make sure that we are able to truly see things from their perspective. In looking at that order of a Montessori prepared environment, not only are things at the child's level, but there is an order to everything that we do. As I mentioned before, Montessori children are directing their own learning. They're making choices on their own. And if environment is disorderly, if it's cluttered, if materials aren't replaced back in a routine order in a place where children have found them before, they're unable to repeat those experiences and they'll struggle with that direction of their own learning. So when we talk about order in the Montessori prepared environment, we're looking at the shelving and the sequencing of materials. And the rule of thumb I use is top to bottom, left to right. So, and what we're looking at there is the more concrete experiences moving into the more abstract experiences. So you're going to be looking from the child's perspective, starting in the top left corner with the most concrete experiences. And as you move through the environment, you'll be moving to more abstract as you move across to the right. Once again, we mentioned the learning materials that need to be included in this prepared environment. We're going to go into more detail about that in just a few minutes. It's important to remember that Montessori materials all include what we call a control of error. The control of error is a Montessori term we use that basically allows us to recognize that every material we present, the child needs to have a way to check their own work. The goal of a Montessori material is the child can work through the process all the way through to the completed product. And when they've reached that point of completion, they're able to check whether they've done it correctly or to meet the expectations on their own without any direction or guidance from an adult. We don't want them to have to check in with us to make sure they've done it right. So Montessori materials will include a control of error, which is a way for young children to check their own work. Again, we're making sure to encourage all types of freedom in our classrooms, freedom to move around, freedom to make their own choices, freedom to spend time on any material they would like for any amount of time they would like. There's not ever going to be a timed expectation in a Montessori classroom. We're really looking to build the freedom of choice, the freedom of movement, and the freedom of concentration. It's important that Montessori materials are realistic. You'll notice in many of the materials in the classrooms here at the garden, the photos we use are of real animals as compared to maybe a cartoon version of an animal. The photos we use in any of our language or other experiences, we're going to be based in real life. And also on that note, it's important to recognize that we're meeting the needs of the whole child in these environments. So we're looking at not only their academic learning and growth, but also their physical health, their social and emotional needs, and everything that would be included in meeting the needs of the whole child. Let's talk a little bit about infant environments. Now, in an infant environment, again, we are looking at that sense of order. Even for our youngest child, we need to make sure that our environment is uncluttered. It's important to include that low shelving and that low wall art, again, at your child's level. You might have to do some adult tummy time to make sure that we're putting these in a way that the young child can recognize and really feel comforted by that sense of order. You can see here that a disorder can disturb a small baby. That can be upsetting to him. They may express suffering through cries or agitation that you might not be able to put your finger on, but something to keep in mind as you're preparing your home environment is if you're noticing maybe some discomfort in your child, maybe look at the order of the environment, see if there's some ways that you can adjust that or accommodate it to make your child feel more comfortable in that environment. Now, we know that young children are strongly attracted to lights, colors, and sounds. Those are all those things that are going to bring that interest, really encourage that child to choose the materials on their own. Materials that are beautifully prepared, include bright colors or beautifully polished wood, all of which the child can visually delight in. Now, it's important that along that same lines that the materials you're implementing in your environment are never broken. Again, that takes away from the beauty, from that aesthetic value. It's also important to keep in mind that all materials must be fully complete if you put them into your environment. A young child will not be successful in directing their own learning if they come across an activity or an experience that's missing pieces, because then they won't be able to complete it successfully on their own. Now, keeping in mind that as children or young children and infants are working in this environment, it's important that they are taking in images with a maximum amount of clarity. So they're distinguishing things as far as one thing from another, that things aren't on top of each other, and they can really start to recognize the stability and the freedom of movement and the routine and the familiarity of that home environment. Stimulation is a key word for our youngest children. It's way too easy to go throughout the day without making eye contact or picking up a book. Those connections, that attachment we have with our youngest children, with our infants, provides that necessary stimulation along with the prepared environment. You'll see here that I took these notes from a Doing Montessori at Home with Your Infant. I will have these links available on the parent portal along with the video version, the recorded version of today's parent education class. So if you'd like to do a little bit more research on your own, feel free to find these links on the parent portal as well. Okay, let's move on and talk a little bit more about toddler environments. Okay, so in toddler environments, we're going to be looking at a variety of important features. So in the toddler environment, we're focusing a great deal on hand-eye coordination. Children of this age are really in a sensitive period for that. We need to make sure we're providing opportunities for them to explore that important skill. A toddler Montessori environment will be guided by music and movement. Of course, young children respond to the rhythm and routine that comes along with familiar songs and rhymes. And as we know from our youngest children at home, young children and toddlers thrive on movement. Requiring them to sit in a stationary spot for an extended period of time is an unreasonable request for a toddler age child. So it's important that we're offering opportunities for music and movement throughout the day. We're also offering what we call practical life activities. Practical life is exactly what it sounds like, the activities of daily life. That might look in your home like assisting in general care and maintenance. The word we as adults might use is chores, whereas Maria Montessori really determined that real life work and participation in those activities of daily life really allowed young children of this age to grow and develop in a way that was meaningful and purposeful for them. Some of those activities of daily life, of practical life that your young toddler can be included in might be unloading the dishwasher, might be sorting laundry. It can look like watering plants or scrubbing, cleaning, sweeping, mopping, maintaining some type of the environment. In a toddler environment, of course, there's an important opportunity for arts and crafts and the visual stimulation that comes through those activities. And of course, the value through being creative. And as in all of our environments, we are going to put an extreme focus on the language and communication that we're using in this environment. A few notes when talking about the Montessori toddler environment is it is important to make sure that your environment you're preparing includes all of these things listed here, but is also toddler safe. Keeping in mind that young toddlers are still learning through their mouths and through their five senses. So it's important to be aware of things that might be a possible choking hazard for your young child. It's important to be aware that we are going to be using materials, as you see in this photo here, glass vases, things that are breakable items. So it's important that you are able to introduce those materials with the guidelines of safety. There are a variety of external methods that you can look at whether these materials are going to be safe. They make what's called a choke tube, which basically is a small plastic tube, and you can put items in the tube. If it fits in the tube, it will fit in your child's throat, so it's too small to be in your environment. It's also important that with our youngest children, we're providing materials that are easy for them to put away. So we want to avoid materials with lots of pieces or lots of messy materials that a toddler would not be able to clean up independently. We always want to start our toddler environments with less on the shelves and then add more on as children are able to more successfully clean up after themselves and return materials once they're completed. We want to make sure that we're offering age-appropriate challenges. We want to avoid materials that would be too hard or too easy for our students, for our children. For example, those arts and crafts activities, they need to be simple. For example, starting with one color of crayon or one color of watercolor, and then moving on to one or two, increasing that little by little as your child begins to develop those skills, and they can begin to participate in more intricate details. So it's also important that you have provided your children with an opportunity to display any arts or craft work. You can do that by setting up a line with clothespins or maybe a magnetic board where they could put a magnet and maintain their art. So it's also important to provide a small trash can for children working in the arts and crafts area, again, to help kind of clean up and take care of that environment on their own. We talked about the music and movement piece. That includes gross motor options. So you also, throughout these areas in practical life and arts and crafts, the young child will be working on that fine motor control of the hand. It's also important to offer opportunities for those big muscles to move around. In a toddler classroom, that might look like the Pickler triangle. Those of you that have been in parent-child class might have seen that. It might look like a sit and spin or something that allows the children to pick things up and carry them. We call that heavy work. So it's important to include all of those as well. We also want to make sure that we're including, along with those language pieces, that includes communication, conversation, as I mentioned previously, eye contact, that back and forth with your child. But we also want to include an opportunity for them to see printed materials. So it's nice to include maybe a book corner or a cozy area where the child can go away and do some quiet work, or you might also include in that area a basket of soft items, or like we have here in our toddler environment, maybe a glitter jar if the child would like to spend some time being mindful and really taking a step back from the movement or noise if necessary. We want to make sure that we are offering opportunities for science exploration and sensory exploration. That can be seen in the form of even Play-Doh or a rice bin. We want to make sure that we're giving them a place where they can talk together. And again, keeping in mind that we're not going to be keeping them in one spot for any sort of extended length of time. And any type of gathering should include lots of movement and interesting opportunities that will keep your child engaged in what they're exploring and working with at home. Okay, let's talk about primary environments. Now, this is what the list I have here is going to talk a little bit more about basically the content areas that we include in a primary or early child environment, a Montessori environment. So you'll see some transference from those toddler environments. Our older children are working with practical life skills, of course, building on more advanced skills and building off of what they'd mastered throughout their toddler years. We're working in the areas of sensorial development. That is exactly what it sounds like, working in materials that develop the 5 senses. Students in the primary age demographic are looking at mathematics. We're looking at, of course, beginning with numerals from 1 to 10, some linear counting, and then possibly even moving into some decimal system work and place value. Of course, in the language area, we're looking at both oral language and written language, and then going to be discussing reading and writing skills in that area. In the cultural area of primary classroom, we're going to be focusing more on geography and history, the people, the places of the world around us, and some comparisons and contrasts of what that looks like as compared to the environment that we're familiar with. In the science area, of course, there is a wide spectrum of materials that can be concentrated on there. I will note that typically in a Montessori early childhood classroom, the students are focusing a great deal on the characteristics of animals, plants, and the world around them, looking at the life cycles of things and the characteristics of a variety of items found in nature. There's also a component of peace education to look at when bringing Montessori primary materials into your home. That's the tool we're going to look at as far as peace education goes, and looking at conflict resolution, and basically encouraging the love of learning in your child to continue all throughout their school years. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about how to set up and show Montessori activities. Now, the first thing to remember is to remember all those details of the prepared environment that we just talked about, the physical health and the psychic health that is necessary, keeping in mind the safety of the environment, making sure that the environment is light, warm, and cleaned, well maintained, that anything in the environment might be not poisonous. I say that because a key component of Montessori environments is that natural aesthetic beauty, and you can really get a lot of that through greenery and through plants. So I do encourage plants and greenery in your environment. That's also a great practical life lesson for students to care for those plants on their own, but making sure that you've researched what type of plants might be safe in that environment. We already discussed the child-sized furniture. It's important that that's attractive, well-maintained, not broken, not wiggly. The tables sit flat on the floor. There's no breaks or things that would make that unsafe. And also that they're lightweight. Some of that heavy work, and again, the child preparing their own environment, is a child in a Montessori environment will have the freedom to move chairs around to accommodate their needs. They might need to relocate to another place in the classroom. So we are in the home. So we want to make sure that all of the materials and furniture that we're using is lightweight. So a child, as they grow and develop a little bit older, are able to move those as needed. Again, we're talking about the shelves. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Even in a home environment, there needs to be a way for you to display and arrange materials at the child's eye level. So they are within reach of a child and sequenced in a way that we talked about before, that top to bottom, left to right, that more concrete to advanced. I will note that in typical home environments, if you're not looking at some of these practices, a lot of families will keep toys, say, in a toy box. While that's a great method of storing materials, unfortunately, there's no drive there for students to select things on their own. When we place all the materials in maybe a toy box, we're losing that aesthetic value and that drive for children to want to make a selection on their own. That goes along with the same note I have here is don't pack things in. It can be overwhelming for young children when we're asking them to direct their own learning if there is too many choices. So blank space would actually be more effective than cramming in more. The value in that is that in your home environment, if you have a lot of materials, what's nice is you can not pack things in, keep things very simple, and then it's easy to change out those materials after your child has either reached mastery in some things you have out, or maybe has lost interest in some of the materials. You can pull those off and bring out new materials, and it's like a brand new environment again, and you don't have to make any additional purchases or spend any additional money. Again, just keeping in mind that the space your child is in is simple and attractive. Keeping in mind the materials you're providing are going to target one skill or one concept. It's important to keep in mind that we're not going to be overwhelming a young child's brain with too many skills at one time. So we like to call that isolation of a skill or isolation of one target concept. So keeping in mind as you're building and preparing materials, what is the goal behind this? Sometimes I'll sit and think to myself, what do I want the child to learn from this experience? Or what do I want them to take away? What do I need? What are they going to get from this that will prepare them for what comes next? So keeping that in mind. And also Maria Montessori felt strongly that natural materials would be preferred. That gets back into that aesthetic value. Most of the materials in a Montessori environment are made of wood based on the lightness of touch of those, the aesthetic appeal of those. Kind of my disclaimer I'll say when people would enter my classroom is if it's made of wood, it was probably designed by Maria Montessori herself. If it's something that is plastic or paper, it's something I, as the adult in the environment, have brought in to supplement some of those core learning experiences. Keeping in mind, it's important that we are preparing these environments in an orderly fashion and with these materials prepared prior to the child entrance to the space. So it's important that, maybe after bedtime each evening, the adult might pop into the space and make sure that it's orderly and prepared before the child were to re-enter again the next day. Keeping in mind that it's important outside of preparing this environment, there still needs to be some supervision. There still needs to be some direction. My job as the Montessori guide in the classroom is to observe my children as they move through these prepared environments and watch and take note of what areas that they're really excelling in and what materials they've reached mastery in, and maybe what materials are a little bit too challenging and aren't meeting them at their developmental level. So even though this space is prepared and we want our child to work through it independently, it's still important that we're available to supervise and guide when necessary. Again, these materials need to have an opportunity to be stored, and children need to be able to move around in the class, in the home space. And again, we come back to offering wall space for child level art, or them to hang up any materials or art that they'd like to share. It's important that you place any supplies that the child might need in the areas near their activities and keep them in good condition. An example of that would be making sure that colored pencils are sharpened, that markers aren't dried out, things like that. It's important that children have access to all of the tools they might need to be successful without having to seek out an adult and ask. Of course, there are accommodations to that, keeping in mind that your child needs to be prepared for those experiences with what we call a lesson. We're going to get into that in just a minute. So for example, that might be if you have scissors in your art area. We want our young children to be able to choose that material and work with it independently. But if your child has not had a lesson or a presentation on how to use scissors safely, they're not going to be able to use those without adult assistance. Okay, so that's exactly what we're going to talk about now. It's presentations. In a Montessori classroom, children are taught how to do each activity by an adult, a prepared adult in the room, giving them a presentation. That is absolutely something that can be done in the home environment as well. Throughout that presentation, each activity is broken down into little steps, procedural pieces. That includes from start to finish, from the moment the child might take the tray or the basket from the shelf. We're going to talk a little bit more about trays and baskets in just a minute, through presenting the activity step by step, all the way back to returning the tray to the shelf. Now, we have previously talked about that Montessori activities are often organized on individual trays and baskets, and within that tray or basket will be everything the child needs to complete the task all by themselves. Working through these steps, you will find that all Montessori materials or presentations have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, as you're presenting these materials, you might not ever reach the end of the presentation. It's important to keep in mind as you're moving through the presentation, as you're talking with your child and showing them these materials, if there's ever a moment where they might not be ready for that, or they might not have all the developmental skills necessary, that you're going to stop where you are. There's no reason to work through the entire sequence, because we want to make sure the children are reaching mastery before we move on to the next step. So while all Montessori materials have a beginning, middle, and end, the child might need to work with a smaller part of the sequence as they develop, and then they'll be able to complete the fuller work cycle as they develop and grow a little bit older. Again, keeping in mind Montessori activities must be complete. It's important while you give the presentations that the activity is complete. Example, if you were to sit down and show a puzzle to your child and it were missing a piece, the young child would feel defeated and not really be able to reach that feeling of a sense of mastery or completion. As we know, with all the time we've spent with young children, children do gain mastery through repetition. So the activities that you're presenting need to be right at their developmental and ability level. And there is going to be times where you're presenting the same material repeatedly and continuing that exploration as long as your child might need. When presenting Montessori activities at home, it can be helpful. And I will say, I do this also before I would put a material out in the classroom. It can be helpful to set up the activity first and do it yourself. You might break down the steps in the way you want to talk to your child about it through that presentation, and see how your child might manage, or maybe make some adjustments on the language you're going to use, or how much or how little talking you're going to do. It's important that we let our child choose the activity for as long as they're interested in it. And we want to give them the opportunity to develop as extended amounts of concentration as we can. So we want them to use the material as long as they can without interfering. However, through our observations, it's important that we stay close and notice if they're struggling or getting frustrated. That will be defeating to a young child. And we want to step in at that point and represent. Watch, let me show you again. Then we can step back again, see how they continue to manage, and continue those back and forth presentations and offering that support when necessary. All right, some tips to keep in mind when showing an activity to a young child. Maria Montessori found that young children can be easily distracted. So it's important when showing a material that we're not taking away from the beauty and the aesthetic value of the material itself by wild and crazy hand motions and lots of talking and loud voices. So it's really important that we're making precise, slow hand movements that our child can observe clearly. That might even be a little bit over dramatic. Some of you in my parent-child class have seen me do a very dramatic, sorry, I was looking for my pencil, a very dramatic pencil grasp. So I'll hold my hand in a very interesting position, and I'll make a big to do about how that three-finger grasp is going to look. So we want to make sure that we're moving slowly and deliberately so the young child can observe clearly. It is a rule of thumb to avoid talking as we show these initial demonstrations and presentations. Maria Montessori found that children will be distracted by our words, whereas they will gain more through some of the concepts we've talked about previously in these education sessions. We're looking back at that absorbent mind, that unconscious or that conscious absorbent mind. When young children are truly in a sensitive period for this type of development, the talking we might be doing during a presentation can actually be detrimental to the young child as compared to beneficial. They really get the most value through watching, through our demonstrations being slow and precise in observing capacity as compared to a large amount of talking. It's important to try to show your child the same way to complete each material each time. That will make it easier for them to pick up any steps they might have missed if it were repeating presentations. Also, it's important to handle objects in a way that the child can manage. You might observe that a tray with pieces, maybe it's a practical life activity that's looking at flower arranging, and you've chosen a vase that is slightly tall. And as the child pulls the tray off the shelf, the vase falls down. Well, that's not going to break or hurt anyone. It's encouraging the child to use more slow movements and recognizing that we want to make sure that we're only giving children objects that they can manage. With our young children, especially our toddlers, if you're a parent of a toddler, I'm sure you've heard this. If a young child does not want us to help, which no, let me do it myself. We hear that a lot. They might be open to a verbal cue, something we can pull out from our presentation that might remind them about what was happening during the initial presentation. Or we can let them keep trying by themselves until they master the task. As long as your child isn't showing extreme frustration or anger, it's okay to let them keep trying. Or your child might decide they're not wanting to work with that material right then, and they might walk away and want to try it again another time. And that's okay too. Again, this is the goal behind a truly prepared Montessori environment, is that the children are directing their own learning, and we are really just available to prepare and to guide them through those experiences. A useful reminder for adults when we're showing our child something new is show. Slow hands, omit words. I thought that was a really helpful tool. Okay, on that same note, some general principles to keep in mind when we're looking at preparing our environment and how to offer Montessori materials to young children. Let the child lead. If your young child is incredibly interested in dinosaurs, then prepare materials for your environment that have dinosaurs on them. If your child is in a sensitive period or has a schema for enveloping or positioning, make sure that you're providing activities that meet those needs and interests, and also that you're exposing your children and preparing those materials and showing them at your child's pace. Once again, I cannot continue to say how important the value in concentration is. Once again, we say, let our children work with the activity as long as they would like. Also offering the opportunity for repetition. That means they're repeating, they're practicing, and they're building that concentration. It is important to try not to interrupt the child during deep focus. That's why transitions in the classroom space can look different depending on what the work period is looking like. So it is important to try to accommodate your child's focus as best you can. Of course, at home, there are different things that will come up. It might be dinner time, it might be nap time, a visitor might come to the door, you might have a play date and things to do. But just trying to keep in mind that the child, when the child is deeply focused and concentrated, trying to avoid interrupting that. In a Montessori classroom, we do try to avoid quizzing the child. That means avoid prompts or questions that will allow the child only one correct answer. Instead, encourage them to name things or ask questions that arouse curiosity and maybe not a right or wrong answer. And then again, without quizzing the child, just watch, just observe your child to see what they're still practicing and what they've already learned. It's important to encourage and model for our children that we need to put our activities away when we're finished. I have gotten some feedback from families of young children or toddlers there where, Kate, we put things on the shelf and they just pull everything out and dump it on the floor. That's a very common practice, and it takes a lot of repetition and practice and routine to recognize what that process and that procedure looks like from start to finish, that beginning, middle, and end. We're going to emphasize for our children there is a beginning, middle, and end to each task, and we're going to model and continue to repeat what that looks like. So there is, and if you're in my parent-child class, you'll see me kind of wandering around behind them and picking up materials as they leave them behind. But what we're doing is we're modeling where things belong. So I might say, oh, I see that you're finished with this matching work. Remember, we're going to put it right here on the shelf. Do you see where that goes? We can then work with them to continue practicing, preparing their environment and replacing things to where they belong. Then we scaffold onto that by then modeling, encourage them to do it themselves. So that's just kind of a continually evolving practice. So the first few times I might walk it back to the shelf myself. The next time I might point or tap to the shelf where it belongs. And then eventually they'll be doing that on their own. Again, this might not happen every day or every time, and they're going to need some help breaking down these tasks into the more manageable parts. We want to make sure that we are modeling. And through that modeling, we're also going to show appropriate and proper use of materials. Now, we want our children to explore the materials. We want them to have a hands-on approach, but it's important that they're stopped if they're using materials inappropriately. That would mean we're throwing blocks at the kitchen window. We are using scissors to cut our sister's hair, things like that. However, if they're not harming themselves, if they're not harming the materials or someone else, then there really isn't a need to interrupt them. But that is going to be based on the freedom within limits and the guidelines that you've set up in your home in that environment. Of course, we always can gently step in and model what that will look like again if the objects are being used inappropriately. Again, we're making modifications to meet each child. Through our observations, we'll find an activity needs to be made a little bit easier or a little bit harder and then built upon slowly. By that, we can, maybe we introduce an item that has maybe 10 objects and the child feels overwhelmed by that. So you can instead, you can pull out a few items and offer them fewer choices at the beginning. Once again, we're mentioning arranging items on your shelf from easiest to hardest, with that increasing difficulty moving from left to right, which in a roundabout way is actually preparation for your young child for reading. The skill they need to follow text across a page comes from that preparation and how we prepare our environments. Also, keeping in mind that providing a Montessori home environment and making materials in your home for Montessori does not have to be cost prohibitive. You absolutely can use what's available in your home already and make materials from things that you already have. However, keeping in mind that you need to be careful with smaller parts and sharp objects. So, but not being helicoptery, but making sure that you've offered those presentations and are supervising their work in a calm way. Okay, now how to set up an activity. Here I have a picture of what would be some practical life materials. So we could do, there's a variety of options here. This is actually not just one material. These are a variety of practical life experiences that this person is looking to prepare and develop to put on the tray that you see there. Now, again, we've already talked about, we're going to prepare our materials in a tray or a basket. That's beautiful and aesthetically pleasing to the child. Keeping in mind, I'll usually use like matching colors to really draw the child's attention. We're going to put that material on the shelf rather than storing activities in a toy box. Children are more likely and to direct their own learning. It's easier for them to be successful when they can see what's available for them when things are put on some type of shelf. Of course, making it attractive in that tray or basket and using coordinating colors. That can also help students recognize what belongs together, keeping all of those necessary items together. Young children can respond to a color coordinated system. They can recognize that if all of the items that are blue belong in this area, it's easier for them to complete the process beginning, middle, and end when there's some general guidelines based on the aesthetics of the environment. Also, as we spoke about, making sure to prepare everything so the child can help themselves. All of these materials need to be ready, either in that home space or whatever area you're using prior to the child entering it so they're successful on their own. And of course, it's important to show the child how we undo the activity. For practical life, that might mean dumping out any water we might have used. We're not going to leave standing water on a tray on the shelf. So part of that presentation is when the child has reached completion is taking the water pitcher over to the water source and dumping it. Then we're replacing materials back in a prepared manner. All right. So that was a lot coming at you. If you have any questions, of course, we're going to talk for a few minutes right now. And then that is my contact information there. You are always welcome to reach out to me by email. That is katebigelow@thegardenmontessori.org. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and you can feel comfortable. If you have a question, feel free to either speak up or type it there in the chat box. Oh. So I see a question coming. It looks like everybody can read it. So I love that. Look at all these Montessori terms coming through. Uh, so you're absolutely right that each child is at a unique stage. And while Maria Montessori's curriculum is not necessarily guided by ages and stages and developmental levels, what it's interesting. I'm not surprised that you have heard a spectrum of answers from as soon as they're talking to never before they turn 3. That actually does not surprise me at all. So what we are looking at when it comes to those older children as they're growing a little bit older, and specific sound games, beginning sound. I Spy is a material, for those of you that might not be familiar with it, is basically a discrimination activity where we're breaking apart the sounds in words, whether that be beginning sound, middle sound, or ending sound, and having children work on some auditory discrimination of what they hear. It's a very basic introduction to stretching and blending, segmenting words like that. Sandpaper letters are a core Montessori material, one of the key lessons for reading and writing. It offers a sandpaper textured letter that the children then utilize for recognizing not only the sounds that letters make, but preparation for writing those letters and that association there. So what I would say to that is, while Maria Montessori, there we want to follow each child, but there are some general guidelines in what Maria Montessori deemed what we call a flow chart. So she has delineated some approximate ages that children might or might not be more in tune or apt to taking in these specific skills. So my recommendation there, as soon as they're talking, of course, we're constantly saturating our child's environment with language, whether that be through print or through conversation. I would sway away from never before 3, because I think that what we're doing if we are preparing an environment at home is we care a great deal, and we're observing our child. So my recommendation there, especially with what sounds like your knowledge of the materials, is I would look at that flow chart, and I would look at the approximate ages of the child, and then I would do some observations of my own child. What is my child showing me that they are recognizing? What sounds are my child regurgitating? Are they showing interest in texts, things like that? So that is really kind of a general answer that covers 2 things. Yes, follow your child, but there is some research out there that might allow you to define maybe an approximate age where materials like that might be more relevant. Does that? I absolutely can provide that for you, but also the American Montessori Society website is a valuable resource. That website is actually just amshq.org. And I can share that in the parent portal as well. So that's actually where the flow charts are available for the general public. But it looks like if you are a current family here at the Garden and Wild Hearts, I can absolutely provide you with a hand copy as well, a paper copy as well. Wonderful. Thank you. I will say that the area of language development and learning is my favorite area. So if you have more questions and you'd like to talk about it just kind of one-on-one, please reach out. I can talk about language learning all day. I see I have another question here from Christine. Looking at ways to de-escalate frustration when the child does not want help, but are still getting frustrated. I understand. Okay. An example of that, but then offering to take the block and put it in for guide them again, show them one more time, getting more overwhelmed. That's a really good question, and something that we will see a great deal in young children. So while we are stepping in when that frustration escalates, but they don't want that assistance, the wording I might use is so the child's getting frustrated, the block won't go in. We step in. Let me show you again. Can I show you one more time? No, no, no. At that point, I would intervene in a more direct way. I can see that this material, that you're feeling frustrated. I think that we're going to put this material away until we've had more time to practice. So basically, you're pulling that frustration away. You're using your observations to redirect to a material that they might be more prepared for at that time. There might be, even after that, if you've, said, we're going to wait on this material, let's find something else to do. There might still be some resistance. There might still be some big feelings that need to come out after that. And you can say things like, I know that you were working really hard on that, and I want you to be really happy when you've been able to complete that. So I'm going to show you something else that will help you to be more successful. So at that point, you might want to take that material and put it away, and then guide your child to maybe a new presentation, that distraction technique. Does that answer your question? Wonderful. I appreciate the examples. It can be kind of hard to discuss these in more of a general type of principle. So absolutely providing the examples is very helpful. And again, if nothing comes up on the spot, I did kind of throw a lot of information at you. If anything comes up in the future, again, feel free to reach out. I want to note that these presentations are available on the parent portal after we have recorded them. They're also available on our YouTube page. So if you don't follow and subscribe to the Garden Montessori on YouTube, make sure to do that as well if you'd rather watch them there. Again, I will place the links that go along with this slideshow there in the parent portal. And if you'd like them directly by email, feel free to reach out at any time. Going to wait a few more moments before I leave the meeting in case anyone would like to ask any additional questions or ask any questions out loud. I would like to thank you all for your time attending today. I really appreciate you taking your time this afternoon to join us, and I look forward to speaking to you again next month. We'll be doing another parent education class at the end of March. So I look forward to talking to you again then. Thank you guys so much for coming today. Oh, hi, your sound's off still.
I was gonna tell you you can stop recording too.
Oh, okay. Yeah, let's do that.